So my name is Jay Botsford. My pronouns are Z's, yours, theirs, or they, them, theirs, which is really just an out that I give to people because folks aren't actually comfortable using pronouns, mostly beyond he and she, but definitely not beyond they. And I mean, my background has been as a youth worker from the age of 15, although I didn't start doing LGBTQ plus youth work in a focused way until I was 18 and was actually out in college, and then transitioned shortly thereafter. And that was in Milwaukee, Wisconsin. So I have a lot of perspective kind of doing youth work in an urban area with LGBTQ plus youth, and then also youth from the surrounding 3 rural counties coming into the city as able to try to get some amount of services, because nothing really existed while I was there. And I was there from 2004 to 2011. So it was a good 7-year stretch. And we saw more and more folks starting to come from counties around Milwaukee because they just couldn't access any safe resources or any safe people. And then there was also some, I also have had a lot of connections with other youth workers throughout the state of Wisconsin, which, although we have kind of 3 large urban centers, well, 1 large and 2 large urban centers, it's a vastly and huge rural state. So what really brings me to this is just kind of thinking through and talking about what services can look like now. I work in higher ed now. I was a nonprofit for a long time. I did a lot of work with runaway and homeless youth. And now I'm doing some work with college students, which is a vastly different population, but still facing a lot of the same things, particularly in this current trash fire of a socio-political context. Does that answer your question?
Well said. In this current,
I just want to kind of wave vaguely at everything, just go, well, this.
Yeah. You mentioned transitioning in college, and I'm not sure that all of the viewers will understand what you mean by that right away. Could you say what that means for you?
Yeah, so I came out as trans when I was 19, and that's really what I mean. A lot of people tend to kind of limit this idea of transition to medical or surgical steps, which is one kind of transition that folks can do. There's a lot of other things, though, that can be part of affirming yourself as a trans person, or if you identify as a man or a woman, rather than the gender that folks have perceived up to that point. So for me, this was about, figuring out how to physically present myself in a way that I felt comfortable, changing my name, changing the pronouns that I was using, losing almost all of the support around me, which was not a chosen transition step, but is a pretty common one. I mean, I will also say, this was 2002. So I want to be able to say that things have improved drastically in 18 years, and in some places they have, in some ways they have, for some kids they have. But I definitely would not have been able to even figure out that I was trans if I had stayed where I was born and grew up, which was Rockford, Illinois. For folks who don't know, it's technically the 2nd largest city in Illinois after Chicago, once you get out of the burbs. But that is not what it feels like. And it's a dying Rust Belt town that is deeply, deeply racist, as most towns are. And had no space for LGBTQ plus young folks to figure out who they are. That seems to be shifting some. I've met some folks now who came out as teenagers in Rockford, which, the 2 friends that I had who came out got beat up every day.
You described that situation growing up as a queer kid in a place where there weren't really resources to even learn how to recognize yourself. What would you say that queer or trans kids need from their rural communities?
Yeah, so there are a lot of things that queer and trans, I would say kids and young adults need, because there's a lot of indications in the research that like what folks are doing in their early to late teens and what they're doing in their late teens to early 20s is the same. So a lot of the things that we think about like mental health or risk behaviors or suicidality tends to just kind of carry through that whole time unless there actually is an external support system of some kind. So the first thing that I would say that they need is they need at least one trusted adult. And that doesn't have to be someone in their family. They do need to have someone who they can meaningfully talk to and connect with, who's going to have an authentic, transparent connection with them, and who isn't going to police them, call the police in for them, and who's going to also be able to manage mandated reporting in a meaningful way. And what I mean when I say that is that when someone is disclosing something that's getting close to a report, that you stop them and intervene and say, hey, we're getting into this territory. So if you want to share that what that means is I'm going to have to make this call and this is what this is potentially going to look like. If this is about a friend or you have a hypothetical question for me, we can talk about that, and that's not going to activate that reporting structure. And that puts in their hands, do I need intervention? Do I need help from the outside in particular ways that may be particularly risky for me? Like if we're talking about, you know, a BIPOC kid, Black, Indigenous, person of color, or a kid with disabilities, particularly if they're autistic or have visible mental health, whether that's, you know, they have symptoms that people see, or they are self-harming in a visible way, or they're expressing suicidality verbally a lot to people, or, you know, because of depression, they're not taking care of themselves, for example, the likelihood that the intervention is going to be even more violent than it would have been in the first place goes way up. So the likelihood that they or a family member could be seriously injured by social workers or police coming in, whether that's emotionally injured or physically injured or both, goes way up when we start talking about these intersections of social groupness and power and oppression. So if you can be that one safe person, though, that they can actually talk to and get answers from, and when you don't know, you say, I don't know, let's figure it out together, great. They need access to accurate information about their health, about who they are, about their communities, about their options, about resources. And for resources in particular, they need to actually have a really good sense of what's safe and what's not. So you may only have one shelter for youth in a county, right? Or less. It may be one county over. I know, you know, in Wisconsin, there's one shelter that will oversee, you know, 5-6 counties. We have 72 counties in the state. It's a large state. And so that one shelter, though, are they actually competent to be able to provide support for that young person? And the answer is more often than not, no. There is a lot of organized anti-queer, anti-trans sentiment that is allowed to slide because of religious affiliation, because of individual religious affiliation, because of policies that are put into place that are not properly trained and that no one is held accountable to. So if you say, you know, we have to treat everyone in these ways and we're always going to monitor, you know, if there's harassment, this is how we respond to harassment, but then it doesn't get seen as harassment because it's about gayness. And oh, well, they're just expressing that it's against their religion. Well, that's still harassment to have someone coming to you and saying you're going to hell. Like, that's not a safe place to live. You know, these youth serving organizations need to have training and accountability because training doesn't fix anything, right? Just training doesn't fix anything. So resourcing accurate information, which also means like consistent internet access. Consistent high-speed internet access is better. So if that's only available in libraries, if that's only available in school, then we also need to make sure that the sites that are blocked as pornography or inappropriate, don't just include words like gay. Don't just include words like breast, because someone may need to actually like go and find out information about breast development at 14 because they don't have anybody to talk to. Or if they do talk to someone, then that person's immediately going to know that they're a trans man. And coming out like that is not safe. Youth also need community. And that doesn't necessarily mean that they have to be connected to a huge wide network of other LGBTQ plus youth, although that does help. And online is a great way to connect with those folks. There are really, like, the difference between what I had access to when I was first trying to figure stuff out in 2000, 2001, 2002, and what folks have access to now, it's just a universe of difference, right? That you can just go on Facebook, you can search, you know, gay youth, and you can find 500 groups close to you. That you can find communities on Tumblr, you can find folks on TikTok, you can find folks to connect through Snapchat. And although TikTok is probably on its last legs, given how some adults have interfered with that, there'll be something new soon, I don't know what. Yeah, so being able to connect with other people and just talk about and say things like, I'm feeling this way, does anybody ever feel this way? And to hear from a peer, yeah, I've also felt that way about my body, or yeah, I don't know what to do with dating, or yeah, I get confused about this too, or yeah, this has been helpful, and for me to figure this out is really, really useful. And I will also say that, honestly, a straight cisgender adult person that they connect with can also be that, to just normalize what you're feeling. You know, if somebody's like, I feel really alone because I don't know anybody like me, that's really easy to affirm. Or to say, I feel this way about my identity, and I don't know if it's just weird or other people. Let's find out together if there's other people who feel that way. There's books, there's articles, there's people to connect with on Facebook. Like, you can also help support that youth in that way. I will also just say, with referrals, in addition, you need to be completely honest about what you're referring to people to. So if you refer someone to a, I don't know, let's say another youth camp program, or you refer someone to a social worker, or you refer someone to a psychiatrist or a doctor, or you refer to a driver's ed program, or you refer to, you know, ATODA program because they're dealing with some alcohol misuse stuff, that you know exactly what the level of competency of that program is. You call ahead, you talk to people, and you make sure that that young person knows what they're going into, and that you stay connected to that program so you can also hold that program accountable. I'm sure that many of us, even as adults, can imagine or have personal experiences going into situations where it was very clear that immediately, this is not for you, you are not welcome here, we don't want you here. And in fact, either at that level of kind of neglectful harm, or the much more active harm of, we're going to try to change you, we're going to try to fix you. For example, a lot of AANA, et cetera, programs will build in things like, well, it's just because of your addiction that you're trans. It's just because of your addiction that you think you're gay. It's just because you were abused. And if you just get over your trauma and make amends and do all, you finish your 12 steps if you're in that kind of program, or finish your trauma counseling, then you'll be normal and it'll be fine. I remember referring young people to a driver's ed program that was ostensibly at a affirming youth serving organization. And I knew most of the staff that worked there, and knew they wouldn't be actively harmful, but like also knew that they weren't great. So, you know, called ahead and like let young people know, like, they're gonna say some stuff. If they say some stuff, you know, I will be there. And then they got a new coordinator in who I didn't know was taking over this program. And that person actively proselytized in driver's ed in ways that was all fire and brimstone, you're going to hell for being gay. Because there were some visibly queer kids in that class, and their manager didn't intervene, even though their manager was a person that I thought got it enough to notice when it was a problem. I know better questions to ask now. You know, that was when I was a younger professional. I also take much less nonsense now than when I was, you know, in my early 20s. But I'd rather have a reputation, and honestly, I'd rather y'all have a reputation as the scary person who's gonna protect the hell out of those kids than, oh, but they're so nice to work with. No, be the one that they actually know they have to follow toe the line with. Yeah.
That's awesome. Thank you. You've obviously thought about this a lot. That is so necessary and takes up so much of our energy that I think sometimes we forget to give energy to the other side of things, which is what strengths or assets do queer and trans youth bring to their communities?
Yeah. It always feels like a just kind of ridiculous thing to start talking about. Like, they are so resilient, and holy shit, right? We're talking about young people who often have at least been dealing with low-level rejection from important people in their lives. And that may not be family, that may be friends, that may be school, that may be therapist, that may be, you know, just walking down the street and feeling like that you're never quite safe. And we're also dealing with a lot of folks who are getting active, organized, anti-queer, anti-trans feelings and bias aimed against them. When we start looking at like what young people have and what queer and trans young people have, there is a deep well of creativity that you need in order to be able to navigate systems that were not built for you. And so while I'm not saying that all queer and trans youth are artists, because they're not, right? There are many who are, and there are many who are not. There is a ways of seeing differently and ways of seeing systems that many cisgender heterosexual people, particularly white cisgender heterosexual people, just cannot see because they've been built so that they can't be seen. So when we start talking about, for example, gender and all of the stuff that we have built on gender, which includes sexuality, which includes family, which includes how we organize relationships, which includes lots of really ridiculous laws and medical things. To be able to just go, yeah, I'm opting out of that. And so then I have to figure out other ways to be and other ways to explain myself. And it's really a powerful thing to watch and support and advocate with young people who are just stepping into their power and their creativity. To like go, I don't want this. Nobody wants this. This is toxic for everybody. Why does everybody keep wanting to do this? We got to do something better. Most of the LGBTQ plus organizers that I know started when they were in their teens or their early 20s. Because they had to, at 14, organize their school to get the teachers to actually listen to them and give them and their friends what they wanted. Or at 17, when they were trying to figure out college stuff, they had to figure out how to become an emancipated minor because their family wouldn't support them. And there was no way they'd be able to go to school without that. Or at 19, to be able to transition on the job. And they had to fight that because they didn't have anybody else in their corner. Like, these are all things that young queer and trans folks are doing. And again, no, not all of them, but all of them are fighting for something. There's also, I will say this, like, deep well of resourcing that now is able to happen online, youth to youth, and also youth org to youth, and in some cases, adult to youth, although there are things that we need to work on there from adult queer and trans folks supporting young queer and trans folks and not just talking past each other or being extremely paternalistic and patronizing. That provides, a lot of them just never feel like they have to explain themselves. And I know I and most of the folks that I know who are my age or older have had spent decades explaining ourselves and feeling like we had to. And they're just like, no, this is what I need. You're going to make it happen. You should know better. It's 2020. Like that kind of energy around organizing and connection and creativity is amazing. And I mean, we can see this back through queer and trans community as far back as we have records, finding creative ways to connect, finding ways to use what we're able to get, establishing mutual aid networks before we know what to call them, because nobody else is going to give it. So we got to support each other.
Thank you. So I'm imagining a hypothetical viewer who's not particularly homophobic, not particularly transphobic, but also isn't particularly close to any queer or trans adults that they know of, and wants to be supportive and just has no idea where to start. What would you say to someone like that?
You don't have to have all the answers. You don't have to have all the information. Use the skills that you have as a youth worker, as a teacher, as a social worker, as a therapist to authentically connect with another person. You don't have to know the ins and outs of queer identity and labels and community and scene to be able to say, oh, you're getting harassed at school. That's not okay. I'm going to, you know, how can we plan to do this? And with your consent, how can I intervene in this in a way that makes sense and doesn't make things worse for you? I think there's often this like, but if I add another identity onto the person that I'm thinking of as the default, which when we say default, right, we're meaning abled, straight, cisgender, white, right? Middle class, probably, middle to upper class, English speaking as their first, potentially as their only language, non-immigrant, Christian, right? And so then I see a lot of youth workers get really, but if I'm working with Black youth, then I need to know everything. No, you don't need to know everything. You need to step into humility, own what you don't know, be able to recognize when you screw up, because you're going to, repair the relationship that you screwed up, and find resources to learn more to do better. And that doesn't mean going through every single training for hundreds and hundreds and hundreds of hours. It literally means I have the skill to advocate within the system. The system wasn't built for you. These boxes weren't built for you. I'm not sure what you need. What would be helpful for you, young person who I'm trying to support? Okay, let's work on this system with this skill that I have to navigate this. This is just about applying your skills in the direction that's going to be the most helpful for that young person.
Yeah, I often tell people that what you need to support a trans youth is to, like, if your job is supporting youth, then you know how to support youth, and you just need to let your confusion about their gender not get in your way.
Exactly. Just get out of your own way and also do your own work, because you're going to have shit that gets activated, right? You have internalized stuff around what a man is, what a woman is. You have internalized stuff around what a Black person is, about what an Indigenous person is, about what a disabled or person with a disability is, about what an autistic person is, about what a person living in poverty is, about what an immigrant is, about what a Muslim is. And so you need to identify those things, not so that like I've gone through internalized bias training and I now know what my biases are. No, you need to actually like then get them out of the way. And there's ways that you can do that. I strongly encourage folks to like take some actual like training around application on these kinds of things. So like, how do I de-bias myself in the moment and how do I do it long term? Because if you're working with a youth whose gender you can't figure out, and it's the first time you're doing it, all the stuff around gender is coming up for you, and you're probably starting to think about, well, how do I ask what they really are? How do I figure out what their genitals are? Why do you need to know that? I can think of very few situations in which that is a necessary piece of information. Many of them are involving a sexual relationship, and some of them are involving a medical situation, although not as many as you'd think. Like catheterizing a person is probably one of the few in which that's the most important piece of information to have. If you have an abdominal injury, like where your reproductive organs are is an important piece of information to potentially have if it's a lower abdominal injury, but like,
Right.
that's
And even
really
so,
about
not
it.
the first piece of
Not
information
the
you
first
need.
piece of information, exactly. But people get really, really, really stuck here. And the reality is it just doesn't matter. And you're just gonna have to have a conversation about like, okay, well, this is a program that only accepts people based on what's on their birth certificate.
Mm-hmm.
So if you're gonna go into this program, what that means is they're gonna treat you like a boy, even though we know you're a young woman.
Yeah.
How are you gonna handle that? Because sometimes, right, folks are getting forced into juvenile lockups, they're getting forced into adult lockups sometimes, they're getting forced into other institutional settings, sometimes an institutionalized school that's either connected to a prison or a mental health facility, sometimes just a mental health facility. So how are you going to, what skills do you need to survive this? And how can I help resource you to survive this? Is much more of an important conversation than whatever you're thinking about their gender. It's really about, this is gonna suck because they don't get you. How can I support and resource you?
Yeah. And like you said earlier, being the pain in somebody's butt who's going to follow up, who they know is going to be asking you if they're actually following the best practices that they're supposed to in supporting you.
Yeah. Some of the most effective advocates that I'd met were was a pair of parents that would just show up at their kid's school. Unannounced, no appointment, would just come in and say, we'd like to talk to the principal, or we need to talk to this teacher right now. Just as a check-in, but just a, hey, I'm engaged. Mm-hmm. You can't silence me, and you can't ignore my kid.
Mm-hmm. That's beautiful.
It's one of my favorite things.
We have a couple questions about media representation. So sure. Where do you see positive representations of LGBTQ folks in TV or film these days?
This is assuming that I watch a lot of current media or film.
I mean, if the question's not for you, we can skip it, but old media and film also is fine.
So I do encourage cisgender heterosexual folks and frankly cisgender queer folks and trans folks who just don't really know a lot about kind of trans representation in media to watch the film Disclosure. It's free on Netflix right now. I want to give like all of the content warnings about it because there is a lot of discussion of and representation of anti-trans violence. There's a lot of discussion of and representation of anti-trans stereotypes and bias. That is also very much linked to anti-Black stereotypes, violence, and bias. I mean, particularly, you know, the reality that kind of the first image of a man in a dress, which is real, but there's really this kind of like genderqueered character in a film who was only there for laugh, like comedic relief, right? It was just there for laughter, was made by the same filmmaker who created Birth of a Nation.
Wow.
Yeah. Which Disclosure talks a lot more about. And I will just say that film, although it can be hard to watch for some people, really goes through what media representation has looked like and pulls out the reality that media representation is not an end goal, and it's not an end goal. It is one way to increase possibility models for young queer and trans young youth, and frankly for queer and trans adults, let's be real. It's also a way to increase familiarity with queer and trans narratives for cisgender heterosexual people. And because it often reflects culture, right? Media can both create culture and reflect culture, and it's this weird kind of horrible cycle of concentration of awfulness most of the time. that when the only images that you see of trans women in particular are as sex workers, which, yeah, there are absolutely trans women who do sex work, just like there are cis women who do sex work, and trans men and cis men and non-binary people of all identities who do sex work. When you only see sex workers, or they are represented as either a murderer or a victim, and those are the only narratives you're given. One, what kind of possibility is that for a youth to live into? You can either do a job that everybody says isn't a real job and that puts you at risk for violence because we push it to the margins, it's not a real job, or you can kill people or die, right? That's not okay. And when you're always an object of disgust or an object of marginalization, right? What are we really communicating about what we believe about folks who dare to violate norms around gender and sexuality? So where I'm seeing positive representation now has been in really queer and trans-driven and creative media. So things like the show Pose, although I will also say that there's stuff in there that, of course, and spoilers for season 2, I guess, they kill off a Black trans woman. They kill off Angelica Ross's character. And and it's a violent murder in there, but even when there's positive representation, I mean, Rent is still a major show that everybody watches as they're coming up, or many people watch as they're coming up as queer or trans young people. And the healthy love story is between two cisgender straight people, and the Black or the Latina trans woman dies to save their souls. Like, we're playing out the same kind of tropes that we always play out, and we have like the magical gay character, the magical Black character, the magical Latina character, the magical trans character. So it's hard for me to say, like, yes, media representations are so much more positive. And we have shows like She-Ra and Steven Universe, who are just really lovely and very gay, and they save the world with the power of gay love and non-binary amazingness. And like, that's really beautiful too. Right? Like, again, media representation can't be our end all and be all, but the more power that we put in the hands, frankly, of queer and trans creators, and particularly BIPOC queer and trans creators, the better media that we're gonna just get overall. Because I don't know about y'all, but I cannot watch another show created by white cis straight men. I'm just done. Like, the way that women are presented, the way that non-binary people are maybe presented, the way that queerness is presented, like, everybody lauded the last Star Wars film because there was a 2-second, not even 2-second, 0.2 second maybe, kiss between two women at the very end of the thing. But they queer baited us with multiple characters throughout. And queer baiting is this particular way that movie producers and directors and writers will create characters and imply that there might be a relationship between them that is queer, but then never actually give it to you. So they're trying to like get in the queer dollars, but never actually give you the queer story because they don't want to drive away any of the conservative dollars. There was also queer coding in that film of a number of villains, and queer coding is when we build in, usually with a villain who is a man, build in feminized or feminizing characteristics to imply that the reason that he's bad and evil and the indicators of badness and evilness are because that he is effeminate in some way. Also do this to women, but in with coding masculinity. So
yeah,
I realize you asked me for positive things, and I like go down this spiral of like, I mean, there's good things, but also, and you know me as a person, so that's what's going to happen.
Yeah, I get it.
Like, I would also just love to see youth handed, told, go film your life, go write a story, go take pictures of what your day looks like, go create poetry, go make art of whatever it is in your community that makes you happy and feel good, or about your identity that makes you happy, or that challenges you, or that makes you sad. Like, we need to see all of that. And the people who are going to be that best are queer and trans creators.
Yeah, thank you. My cat has decided to join the interview. I swear the door was closed. There's not much I can do.
Is that
That's Wonder Next.
Oh, it's Wonder Next. Okay, I couldn't tell. Hi, Wonder Next.
So what about books? And I know you've worked mostly with like teens and up, but what positive representations of queer and trans folks have you seen in books, either like YA books or kids books?
Yeah, so I will say that I tend to read a lot of YA dystopian fiction, which there's just not a lot of queerness in ever. It's really kind of sad. So I will say for kids books, some of the greatest things that I've seen coming out have been through a particular publisher called Flamingo Rampant. It's actually a trans publisher, and pays, you know, authors and artists well for their work, and represents a lot of different perspectives and cultures and backgrounds and stories for levels from, you know, kids who are really little, like, you know, 0 to 3, up through kind of puberty and a little bit beyond. So there's some really great stuff coming out of there. I'm seeing more and more, queer authors and trans authors actually being able to write things that are not just freaking memoirs. There's nothing wrong with a memoir inherently, and a lot of times the ones that get picked up are because of a particular kind of major trauma that a person survived that then makes them interesting, and the publisher wants them to write about it. So I think about, for example, Calpurnia Adams, who not only was raked through the mud by all of the media after her boyfriend was murdered, but her boyfriend was murdered because he was dating a trans woman. And so then she writes a story about her horribly traumatic childhood, and then this horrible trauma of having her boyfriend, who was the first relationship she'd had with someone who was actually like really affirming of her gender, murdered. That was a while ago, but still. You know, I'm trying to think of other novels that I've actually read. So most of what I've been reading has been like theory and anti-racist plus gender stuff. So I'm struggling to come up with things off the top of my head that will actually kind of address that. I will also just say that there is this kind of like push for parent stories still, that the best thing that we can honestly do with parent stories is ignore them. And maybe they'll go away.
Can you say more what you mean about parent stories?
So they'll get parents of trans youth or adults. They'll get parents of queer youth or adults, sometimes of a famous person. So like Ellen DeGeneres' mom wrote a book a while back about supporting Ellen DeGeneres, who, you know, is a multimillionaire and is probably just fine, and thinks, and I will put the politics aside for a moment there, has aligned herself in some really problematic ways with some really anti-LGBT people because she thinks they need to be given space because they're also wealthy white people. Because wealth and whiteness will always protect wealth and whiteness. You know, there's been a particular, and there still is this push in media, still some in writing, but also just kind of in like news media or other media, to like get the story of the parent of the trans kid. And that trans kid could be, you know, 5, or it could be 15, or it could be 50. But they always want to talk to the parent about how hard it is and how sad they must be, and how did they grieve the death of their child, and or how hard it's been to advocate for your kid, or how much of a struggle it's been to help them get what they need if they're on the affirming side versus the less affirming side. Or how did you survive when your child was horribly murdered, which is also another one that we just don't need. And what we see in these stories is that the trans person or queer person is turned into an object of discussion rather than a subject with their own story. Information gets shared in ways that often the person, if they're younger, cannot consent to fully, because you actually have to know what the implications of your information being put out there are to be able to consent fully, or just put out there without even trying to discuss it with them because the parent wants to center themselves in the conversation and there's support for them doing that. We'll also see this with like parents, parents of kids with disabilities, particularly parents of autistic kids, that like the story is about the parent and the family and how damaging the kid's disability has been to their marriage or siblings or whatever, versus like the kid telling their story, or the real horror of the whole thing being these systems are not built to support people, and so nobody's able to ever get the information, money, access, accessibility that they actually need. And with queer and trans kids, it's often, oh, they were horribly bullied at school. Well, why did nobody do anything to stop the violence that was being committed against them? Why didn't you have a relationship where you did just figure out ways to do this? Why didn't you activate other resources? Why didn't you find other people instead of just capitalizing on it
now? Yeah, I was gonna say too how similar the dynamic is with problematic parent activism around disability, around autism, around trans stuff. And I highly recommend the parent activism chapter in Tay Meadows' book, Trans Kids.
Oh, yes, that is excellent. That is excellent.
Fascinating. Yeah, and well, and we're going to talk with some parents as part of this series, and I think, well, I trust that they're going to tell a different kind of story than that, which is why we invited them, right?
Right.
And I think for me as a queer adult, part of what I noticed there is that cis straight adults would rather hear from a cis straight parent of a trans kid than have to go directly to a queer or trans adult who might speak firsthand about that experience. And it is sometimes a way to isolate trans adults and trans kids from each other. And I think queer and trans kids really need to see that they can grow up at all, right? That they can live through adulthood. That they can grow up to be okay.
Possibility models are not just about media representation. They're also just about the gays that live 3 doors down in your apartment building who have amazing flowers or plants or whatever, and you hear them cooking together, you see them walking down the street, like just being like, wow, I could be gay in my 50s and have a partner and have what seems to be a happy life. Like, that is wildly out of reach for so many LGBTQ+ kids. So wildly out of reach to just say, wow, there's this person who's doing the kind of work that I want to do. I had no idea that like other people could be engineers, or that a person like me could, I don't know, pick something. I can't think of other jobs right now. But like when I was doing, particularly when I was working at the youth program, in the LGBT youth program in Milwaukee, I had kids constantly telling me that they wanted to be a social worker because they saw me doing social worky kinds of things. And then it was a lot of time spent talking them into other things or trying to connect them with other people to see that there are other possibilities. Because the few of us that were doing the work were the only positive queer adults that they saw around them.
Right. Yeah, I
Don't
love
be a social worker. Stop doing it. Oh God. Sorry.
I love the idea of possibility models and of so often when I talk with parents of queer and trans kids, they talk about famous queer or trans people. And famous is not a job title, and it's also not a life path, right? So like, I think it's really important that adults who are supporting queer and trans youth know queer and trans adults who are not famous. And can have that as part of their imagination of the world.
Because even just being able to say, oh yeah, no, my cousin is a teacher in Georgia, and teaches science at the high school and blah, blah, like that is, what? Your
Right.
cousin is trans and teaches high school biology? You
Right.
too could be a high school biology teacher.
And there's a bad genre of newspaper articles about trans folks along these lines, right?
Oh,
Like,
there are, yeah.
first trans mayor, first trans biology teacher. And like, that's not true. They're not the first. And what's actually interesting is that there are many and
Yes.
many ways to be.
Yes. And you know, keeping an eye out for both kind of positive and negative media representation, and what stories are happening right now and what policies are happening right now, as someone who's doing work in this field, is really important, because what we see when negative policy or negative news is put out is we see spikes in poor health and mental health across the board for LGBT kids, even if it's not necessarily something that would directly impact them. So, oh, sorry, my dog is chewing on something. Drop. Okay. It's cardboard. So even when it's not something that would necessarily directly impact them, so, you know, marriage, gay and lesbian people being able to get married does not have as much of an impact necessarily on a 15-year-old trans kid, right? Or most queer and trans people just want to put this out there. Maybe not the policy we should have invested all the money in, but we didn't. But seeing kind of the anti stuff come out, so like in Wisconsin, we had a constitutional amendment against marriage, and we saw really negative health outcomes for LGBT young people go up because of that, because it was a signal that the people around me, my greater community, don't care about me, don't want me here, and are actively trying to do things to hurt people like me or people I know in my community. Whereas we see positive stuff come out and we see kind of the opposite effect, right? We see a more positive impact on health, on what we would consider risky behavior, which is really just like coping mechanisms that might increase your risks for some things, but if it gets you through today, it's still a healthy coping mechanism because it got you through today. We see a decrease in suicidality. We see improved mental health, right? Because there's a sign that, oh, my community wants me here, values me, actually wants to do something with me. So I worry about things like the HUD rule that just got released, that although, again, it doesn't impact people who are not homeless or fleeing domestic violence or trying to access other kind of housing programs that are run by HUD and that are quote unquote single sex, right? So programs that are only for men or programs that are only for women based on what is on your ID or sometimes your birth certificate. Put out, you know, when they put out this rule that says that you can discriminate against trans people. Oh, and by the way, here's how you figure out if a woman is trans or not, by how she looks, and just top to bottom went through all these signs to look for. What does that communicate to a 15-year-old, even who's stably housed, even who, you know, is upper middle class, let alone the kid who's actually trying to access a shelter, or who's living with a parent who's fleeing domestic violence, or who's staying on the street right now with their family? What does that communicate about who you are and how we think about you? And we got to know this stuff as youth workers. We got to be paying attention to this stuff because that's going to impact and it's going to come in because it is still trauma.
Mm-hmm. Yeah, thank you. So we had a bunch of questions here about intersectionality, and you've mostly just incorporated that throughout, which is better anyway, so thank you for that. Did you want to say anything about fat justice and LGBTQ youth?
Yeah, so, and I realize that this maybe will not be heard as well because I'm also a fat person saying it, right? So I want to also name that. There is this kind of double bind that happens when you're a person who is impacted by the thing that you're advocating for in a positive way, that folks are less likely to listen to you because apparently we're only supposed to be advocating for things that don't make our worlds better for us also, which is silly. Racial justice will make things better for everybody. Like, let's just, anyway. Yeah, so when we start thinking about kind of the intersections of queerness and transness and fatness, what starts to be really apparent is the ways in which queer and trans bodies are talked about in very othering ways in any literature around body, shape, size, and really any health things in general. So what we'll see is there is this ridiculous hypothesis out there, honestly, that lesbians are fat because women don't mind other women being bigger, which, although once you remove like the patriarchal gaze, that is true, that like women have much more space to like express and be in their bodies. There's just this ridiculous like, oh, that must be why. Or there's also this tendency to attempt to explain size through testosterone for cis women who are queer, which is just a ridiculous eugenics crap that you can find that links all the way back to the reason that queerness happens is because of increased testosterone in utero for female fetuses. And so if we just eliminated the extra testosterone, then everyone would be normal and we could eliminate gayness. Not true. Gayness will always happen.
What really gets me about the lesbian fat hypothesis is like, it starts with this idea that lesbians are fatter because they are less susceptible to shame and stigma from straight men.
Right.
And then rather than saying, gosh, maybe more women should be fat then, the conclusion these public health people come to is like, we need to do more weight interventions with lesbians or something. Like they need more shame and stigma, right? It's really, really bad thinking all around.
It is. And the fact that we always jump to like bodies need to be fixed, right? So fat bodies need to be fixed. And the only way that you fix a fat body is to make it less fat. And what we also know, right, the good science is actually indicating there's a lot of bad science. The good science is actually indicating like every single cardiovascular risk that comes and almost all of the endocrine risks that come with body size, with larger body sizes is because of weight cycling. Because you tried to lose and then gained back, and you tried to lose and you gained back, and you tried to lose and you gained back. And your doctor told you to lose 25 pounds or 50 pounds or 100 pounds. And that fails 99% of the time because that's not how our bodies work, and that's not how adipose tissue works. And so when we look at just, in basically every setting, fat folks tend to get treated worse, right? Systems weren't built, chairs weren't built, exam tables weren't built, airplanes sure as hell weren't built for anyone with a real body, let alone a fat body. So right, just the built environment is extremely limiting. And then the systems themselves have this built in that fatness is an indication of either immorality or trauma, or, which is more what I see in like social worky kind of situations, or laziness, or just having bad information. And so if I give you the good information and put you through ridiculous amounts of motivational interviewing about what you eat, then you're going to do better. Or if I think it's because of immorality, then I'm going to shame you and force you to try to shrink to show that you're not immoral and that you are holding yourself accountable. And if I think it's because of trauma, then I'm going to try to focus on your trauma and connect that to poor coping habits. And again, just try to force you to diet and exercise, do an unhealthy, very much diet, and probably unhealthy exercise as well. So with queer kids who are already being exposed to additional stigma just for being queer, right? We're very focused on like bodies being in control and lives being in control. And in control means you look or are a white, cis, straight, middle-class, non-immigrant, Christian, thin, abled person. And so when your body is out of control, because you're Black, because you're disabled, because you're fat, because you're queer, because you're trans, because you're all of these things, then the control of the state and institutions comes down harder. So in a medical setting, what we'll see is the reason, just as a very recent example, the reason that fat folks are dying more often from COVID is not because it's a high risk for COVID. It's because doctors are not providing more immediate care or appropriate care or as intensive care as they are for thin people. And then if you also add the fact that doctors have a bias against trans people and queer people on top of that, then we start seeing that just folks get deprioritized enough, triaged down enough, and then you end up into the it's acceptable if you die or get injured category. Because it's better that you're erased than that you continue to exist in the body that we don't think you should have. It also can just get really hard to get access to programs and to be treated well in them, because again, fatness and queerness are both seen as these, and transness, are all seen as these signs of immorality, trauma, mental health problems, laziness, lack of control. And then we feel the need to control you more. So people who are fat are more likely to be seen as violent, are more likely to be seen as increasingly dangerous people. And we see that in police response also, and in social work response. And I don't necessarily mean like the social worker that you go to for therapy once a week who's really lovely with you, but like when the social work child welfare system gets activated, the fact that your kid is fat and queer could mean that they'll get taken away from you because you're neglecting them as a parent by allowing them to be fat and queer. Even when there is nothing else happening there except that your kid is fat and queer.
I want to try, I know this is not in character for either of us, I want to try to end on a couple of positive notes. So all of this you've just said, so important. And also, here's the thing I've noticed, tell me what you think of it.
Sure.
Queer art, sometimes really fat phobic, just like any art.
Oh,
and also
so
sometimes there's like really awesome queer positive fat positive art that that does that thing that lesbian culture does of like being a little less impacted by the shame and stigma of the straight male gaze.
Yeah. It is amazing, like the way in which the gaze of the patriarchy gets activated among gay men is really sad. Mm-hmm. It's just depressing. And frankly, among a lot of trans folks too, particularly folks who are attracted to men. But yes. Art is
so one last maybe happier question. Our intended audience is primarily adults who want to support queer and trans youth, but also queer and trans youth or youth who might have friends who are queer and trans or who might or might not be queer and trans might see this. Yeah. So what might you want to say to them that maybe you wish you had learned earlier than you did?
You do not owe, well, let me start that again. You do not owe your story to anyone. You do not owe control of your story to anyone or to any institution. And that doesn't mean that sometimes they don't try, but you get to decide what it is that you want to say and do and live and how that comes across. And you get to decide what you want to do with that story. It's really easy to feel like if you just share the hard things and the good things, that adults will listen to you more. And if you just say, my community is amazing, that folks will actually go, oh, okay, your community is amazing. Or if you say, if you take this away from me, then I'm going to go back to this really dark place that I was in, and here, let me give you all the details of that dark place, that they'll listen to you. The reality is a lot of them will not, and it sucks. And it is more important that you hold what you want to hold and just know that you deserve the things that you need to live your life in the ways that you want to live it, have the community that you want to have the story that you want to have, then you deserve those things because you're a human being. You deserve those things because you're a queer, trans, cis, straight, whatever, right? You deserve those things because you are a human being. And advocating for yourself is a skill that you're going to be forced to learn. And it's going to be a skill that's going to serve you really well. It's going to be a skill that you're forced to learn. And you can still be angry that you have to learn that skill. And you can use that skill in whatever ways you need to. And the fact that we're able to use it for each other is really the most amazing thing in all of this. That you can say, oh, my friend's dealing with this? Yeah, you know what? I have skills to help you with this. We're going to make this work for you. And I'm not going to let them off the hook. Because you know what? We all can do that for each other no matter our age too. And I wish I had known that when I was a teenager. And I wish I hadn't given as much detail about my body and my life and my story to so many people who didn't deserve it. And now I get to find the people, now that I've learned this, I get to find the people that I want to give it to. And if you learn it now, those are the people you get to find too.
Awesome. Thank you so much, Faye.
Yeah.
Is there anything else that you want to say before we shut off the recording?
I guess I just want to emphasize one more thing particularly to the adults out there who just want to help. You're not here to save anybody. You are here to use your skills to make this world one in which we all want to live. And be hated before you let a kid fall into a toxic situation. Do everything that you can. Be hated by those people, be irritating, get in the way, make it embarrassing, make it expensive. But you actually can make a huge difference just by showing that you're there. But I need you to remember that you're not saving them. You're working with them. And you're trying to fix the institutions that we as adults have built up to this point.